On the morning of November the 3rd, Alphonse Kleiner, constable of the village of Thuan, came upon a blue Mercedes car by the roadside, not far from Lake Biel in one of the French-speaking cantons of Switzerland. It was standing just where the highway from Lamlingen emerges from the woods that surround the gorge of the Thuan River. Kleiner had walked past the car when something caught his eye and made him stop and turn back. In passing, he had glanced through the fog-dimmed window and got a blurred impression of the driver collapsed over the wheel. Thinking that the man was drunk, he strode slowly back to the car, opened the door, and put a rousing hand on the stranger's shoulder. As he did so, he realized that the man was dead. A bullet had passed through one temple and out of the other. At the same time, Kleiner also noticed that the near-side door was unlatched. The edge of a yellow note case showed bright from the overcoat inside pocket, and Kleiner drew it out. With no difficulty, he established that the dead man was Ulrich Schmidt, a lieutenant in the Bern police. The detailed investigation of the Schmidt case was entrusted to the Biel police, but the officer who took charge of it in Bern was Inspector Barlach, who had been the dead man's superior. Barlach had spent much of his life abroad. He had had a distinguished career in the detection of crime, first in Constantinople and later in Germany. Barlach's first action in the Schmidt case was to order it to be kept secret, at least for a few days, and he had to exert all his authority to get the order observed. "We know too little," he said. "Besides, why give the story to the press anyway? Nothing more superfluous than newspapers has been invented in the last 2,000 years. But Barlach's insistence on secrecy was not shared by his chief, Dr. Lucius Lutz, lecturer in criminology at Bern University. Lutz had recently returned from a visit to the police departments of New York and Chicago. What he had seen there had so impressed him that he was now frankly horrified, as he admitted to Commissioner Freiberger as they went home together by tram, at the prehistoric inadequacy of the safeguards against crime in the federal capital of Switzerland. The same morning, having had 2 telephone conversations with the Biel police, Barlach paid a visit to the Schönlers on Bantikestrasse, where Schmidt had lodged. As always, he went on foot. It cost him some effort to climb the steep flight of steps which lay in his path, for he was over 60 and felt it at such times. But eventually he reached his destination and rang the bell. The door was opened by Frau Schönler herself, a short, plump woman, who knew him and admitted him at once. "Schmidt had to go away on duty last night," said Barlach. "He had to leave unexpectedly and asked me to send him some papers he's been working on. Kindly take me to his room, Frau Schönler." She nodded and led the way down the passage. "Where's he gone to?" "Abroad," said Barlach. The room was on the ground floor and overlooked a small park of old brown pine trees. He went over to the writing table and looked around him. On the divan was one of the dead man's ties. He opened a briefcase that lay on the table and glanced inside. Then he quickly tucked it under his arm. "Have you found what you wanted to send to Herr Schmidt?" "Indeed, I have." Deep in thought, Barlach lunched in the Café du Théâtre instead of his usual restaurant. As he ate, he examined the contents of the briefcase, here and there pausing to read absorbedly. Then he left the café, and after a short stroll along the Bundesstrasse, returned to his office at 2 o'clock, where he heard that Schmidt's body had been brought in from Biel. He decided not to pay a call on his deceased subordinate, for he had no liking for corpses. He would also have preferred not to call on Lutz, but he had no choice in this and had to make the best of it. Without examining its contents further, he carefully locked Schmidt's briefcase in his desk. Then he lit a cigar and went into Lutz's office, well knowing that Lutz furiously resented the liberty he took by smoking cigars in his chief's room. Once, some years before, Lutz had dared to object, but Barlach had waved away his objections. Dr. Lucius Lutz received Barlach with more than his usual irritation, for in his opinion nothing had yet been done in the Schmidt case. "It causes me increasing anxiety," began Lutz, "that detective criminology in this country is still in its infancy. God knows I'm hardened to most of the ineptitudes that go on in this canton, but the procedure that seems to be regarded as right and proper in the case of Lieutenant Schmidt throws an even worse light on the professional competence of our rural constabulary." "Oh, come, Dr. Lutz," said Barlach. "Our village constables are quite as competent in their own way as the Chicago police. We shall find out who killed Schmidt. Take my word for it. Have you a lead? Is there anyone you suspect, Inspector Barlach?" Barlach looked reflectively at Lutz for some time. At last he said, "Yes, there is someone, Dr. Lutz." "Who?" "I can't tell you yet." "Well, that's most interesting," said Lutz. "I know you always prefer to follow your own line of investigation rather than take advantage of modern methods of detection, Inspector, but don't forget that time marches on and has no respect even for the most distinguished of reputations. I've seen crimes handled in New York and Chicago in a way we in Bern have absolutely no conception of. But this time, remember, a lieutenant of police has been murdered, and that means trouble for us at police headquarters. We've got to act ruthlessly." "Naturally," said Barlach. "That's exactly what I'm doing." "I'm most pleased to hear it," said Lutz, and coughed. A clock on the wall went on ticking. Barlach placed his left hand gingerly on his stomach, and with his right hand crushed out his cigar in the ashtray which Lutz pushed towards him. He told Lutz that for some time he had not been in the best of health. His doctor had pulled a very long face when last he had examined him. He had frequent attacks of abdominal trouble and would be grateful if Dr. Lutz would appoint someone to assist him in the Schmidt case, someone who could undertake much of the active work. Such a course would free Barlach to concentrate on the finer details of the case. Lutz agreed. "Whom do you suggest as an assistant?" "Schanz," said Barlach. "I understand he's still on leave in the Bernese Oberland, but we can recall him." "A good idea," said Lutz. "Schanz is a man who works hard and keeps abreast of the times." Although it was already nearly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Barlach decided to drive out to take a look at the scene of the crime. He was driven by a big, fat constable named Blatter, who never spoke, and for whom, therefore, Barlach had a warm affection. Kleiner met them and led them to the scene of the crime. They quickly reached the spot where the road was edged by a wall, below which lay the village of Twan. "Where was the car, Kleiner?" "Here," said the constable, pointing, "almost in the middle of the road." Barlach scarcely looked in the direction indicated, but crossed the road and looked down over Twan. There was nothing but vineyards between him and the ancient village. "How's the wine this year, Kleiner?" "It's good. Would you like to sample it?" "Yes, I should enjoy a glass of new wine." He kicked something metallic with his foot and bent down to pick it up. When he stood up again, he was holding a small, elongated piece of metal, crushed flat at one end. Kleiner and Blatter looked at the object. "A pistol bullet," said Blatter. "How did you come to find it, Inspector?" said Kleiner. "Well, just luck," said Barlach. The young wine did not agree with Barlach, for next morning he declared that he had been vomiting all night. Lutz, who ran into the inspector on the stairs, seemed genuinely worried about the state of his health and advised him to consult a doctor. All right, said Barlach. But by the time he reached his office, he felt better. He sat down at his desk, unlocked a drawer, and brought out the dead man's briefcase. At 10 o'clock, when Schanz called to see him, Barlach was still immersed in its contents. "I'm glad you've come, Schanz," said Barlach. "We must have a talk about the Schmidt case. You'll have to take over most of the hard work, I'm afraid. I'm not too well." "Yes," said Schanz. "I heard." Schanz drew up a chair and sat down, resting his left arm on Barlach's desk, on which lay Schmidt's open briefcase. Barlach leaned back in his chair. "We don't know much about how Schmidt died. This bullet, that's all." He laid the bullet he had found at Twan on the desk. Schanz picked it up and looked at it. "It's from an army pistol," he said, putting it down again. Barlach was closing the briefcase. We don't know what took Schmidt to Thuan. He didn't visit Lake Biel on duty. Well, I should have known if he had. We know of absolutely nothing that would explain his presence there. Chance seemed to be only half listening. Throwing one leg across the other, he said, "All we know is that Schmidt was murdered and how it was done." The inspector looked surprised. "What makes you think we know that?" "Schmidt's car had a left-hand drive and you found the bullet on the left-hand side of the road. Schmidt must have been stopped by the murderer as he was driving down from Lamlingen to Thuan. Now, it's possible he knew the man who shot him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stopped. Schmidt opened the near side door of the car to let the murderer get in and sat back behind the wheel. That's when he was shot." Barlach thought over what Chance had said. "You're right, Chance. That's more or less how it must have happened. But it still doesn't explain what Schmidt was doing on the road from Thuan to Lamlingen." "Well, perhaps the fact that he was wearing evening dress may point to the explanation." "I didn't know he was," said Barlach in surprise. "But haven't you seen the body?" "No, I don't like bodies." "It's also mentioned in the official report." "I don't like official reports either." Chance said nothing. "If anything, it makes the case even more complex," said Barlach. "Why should Schmidt wear a tuxedo in the gorge of Thuan?" Chance answered that this fact might simplify rather than complicate the case. There couldn't be many residents in the Lamlingen district who would throw the sort of party for which the guests put on evening clothes. He produced a small diary from his pocket and held it up for Barlach to see. "This was Schmidt's," he said. Barlach nodded. "I've seen it. There's nothing in it of any importance." Chance was less sure. Against Wednesday, November the 2nd, Schmidt had written the letter G. That is the day he was murdered, shortly before midnight, according to the police surgeon. There's another G against Wednesday, October 26th, and again against Tuesday, October 18th. "Well, G might mean anything," said Barlach. "A girl's initial, probably." "Hardly a girl's name, because Schmidt's girl was called Anna, and Schmidt was the steady sort. No, on the days marked G, Schmidt got dressed up and drove off in his Mercedes." "Well, how do you know that?" "From Frau Schönler." "Aha," said Barlach. Chance looked into the inspector's face. "Dr. Lutz told me you have a possible suspect in mind." "Yes, Chance, I have." "Since I've been appointed to act as your assistant in this case, wouldn't it be better if you told me whom you suspect, Inspector Barlach?" Barlach chose his words carefully. "Look here, Chance, all I've got is a hunch as to who the murderer might be. I still have to get the proof. Your job is to be objective, to put your finger on Schmidt's murderer. If my hunch is right, you will reach the same conclusion, though, in contrast to my own methods, you will reach it by unexceptional scientific means. If I am wrong, you need never know the name of the person I suspected so unjustly." Chance said nothing for a while. Then the older man asked, "Do you agree to our working on this basis?" Chance hesitated for a moment before answering, "All right, I agree." When Lieutenant Schmidt of the Bern police was found dead at the wheel of his car wearing a dinner jacket, Inspector Barlach was put in charge of the case. Barlach, nearly 60 and scornful of modern methods of crime detection, was the bane of his chief's life. So Dr. Lucius Lutz, who wanted results, was delighted to assign an up-and-coming young detective, Chance, to assist the unscientific inspector. "What do you propose to do?" said Inspector Barlach. Chance walked over to the window. "Schmidt had marked G against today in his diary. I'll drive out to Thuan and Lamlingen and see what I can find. I shall start at 7 o'clock, the time that Schmidt always started on these occasions." He turned round. "Would you care to come along, Inspector?" Yes, I'll come." "Right," said Chance, a little taken aback, for he had not expected this. "At 7, then?" At 7 o'clock, Chance drove to the house overlooking the river where the inspector had lived for some years. It was raining, and Chance, who had never before been to Barlach's house, peered through the streaming car window at the house numbers. He found the one he was looking for at last, and when repeated hooting produced no sign of life from within, Chance got out of the car and ran through the rain to the front door. It was too dark to find the doorbell, and after a moment's hesitation, he turned the handle. The door opened, and Chance found himself in a small entrance hall. In front of him was a half-open door, a ray of light shining through the aperture. He knocked on this door, and receiving no answer, pushed it wide open. In front of him was a large room, the walls lined with books. Barlach was lying stretched on a divan. He was asleep, but he seemed to have prepared for the drive to Lake Beale, for he was wearing a heavy overcoat. Chance looked cautiously round the room. It had no windows, but there was a door in each wall, leading no doubt to other rooms. A massive writing desk stood in the middle of the floor, and on it lay a large brass snake. Chance started a little as he caught sight of the reptile. "I brought it back from Constantinople," said a voice from the divan. Barlach sat up. "As you see, I have my coat on, Chance. We can go." "I apologize for breaking in," said Chance. "You were asleep and didn't hear me. I couldn't find the bell at the front door." "There is no bell. I don't need one. The door's never locked. Not even when you're out?" No. It amuses me to come home and see whether anything's been stolen." Chance laughed and took up the snake to examine it. "I was nearly killed with that thing once," said the inspector, and Chance noted for the first time that the snake's head formed a handle and its body the blade of a knife. When they reached the hospital, Chance said, "Did you ever drive with Schmidt?" "Often. He was a careful driver." Barlach looked significantly at the needle of the speedometer, which pointed to nearly 60. Chance slowed down a little. "He drove me once. Slow as hell. I remember he had a strange sort of name for his car, but I can't remember now what it was." "He called it Blue Charon," said Barlach. "Yeah, that was it. Charon's the name of a character in Greek mythology, isn't it?" "Charon ferried the dead across to the underworld, Chance. Schmidt's parents were well off. They sent him to a good school. More than my people could afford for me. That's why he knew who Charon was and why I didn't." The car began to climb through the vineyards. Barlach opened the window and looked down at the lake. Lights were mirrored in the water, and a motorboat raced across. They found a bend in the road and drove towards the woods. To their right, the land dropped steeply away. They turned left and crossed a bridge. A broad road lay ahead, the road from Tuan to Lamlingen. Chance pulled up. He switched off the headlights, and they were in complete darkness. "What now?" said Barlach. "We'll wait. It's 20 minutes to 8. They sat waiting. A few minutes after 8, a light suddenly gleamed through the trees from the direction of Tuan, and a few moments later the headlamps of a car flooded them with garish light. A big, closed car sped past them toward Lamlingen and disappeared into the night. Chance started his engine and waited as 2 more cars passed them, large, dark limousines, each full of people. Then he let in the clutch and drove in pursuit. The woods came to an end. Suddenly the cars ahead turned sharply left into a field track, and Chance stopped to watch. Across the field they could see the indistinct mass of a house, surrounded by poplars. Its front door was illuminated, and the cars they had followed were pulling up in front of it. Barlach got out and inhaled deep breaths of the cold night air. He felt better for it. Then together they went down the field track towards the house. They came to a wall with a gate set in it, its rusty iron framework rising high above the level of the wall. They tried the gate. It was not locked. Despite the darkness, they managed to make out a plate affixed to the center bars. Chance switched on the flash lamp he had brought from the car. In the center of the plate was a big letter G. Again, Chance gloated. "You see, I was right. A chance shot that hit the bullseye. "The next step," said Barlach, "is to find out what G stands for." "There's no problem about that," said Chance. "It stands for Gastman." "How do you know?" "From the local telephone directory. There are only 2 Gs in Lemlingen, the others the gendarmerie." They decided to make a complete circuit of the house, going separately in opposite directions. Barlach watched Chance disappear in the darkness before setting off himself. He turned up his coat collar, for he was shivering, and was again tormented by the stabbing pain in his stomach that brought a cold sweat to his forehead. He walked along beside the wall, following it closely as it bent to the right. The house still lay in utter darkness. Then the wall changed direction, and the back of the house came into view. It was ablaze with light. Light poured from the row of windows on the first floor. He heard the notes of a piano. According to his reckoning, he should soon be meeting Chance again. He strained his eyes to see across the light-flooded stretch of lawn, and as he did so, he caught sight of a great dog, only a few steps away as it moved silently out of the shadow. Barlach knew a great deal about dogs, but he had never seen one as huge as this. He saw the brute slowly turn its head and look at him. Its round eyes were bright, blank orbs. And then suddenly the dog leapt. Its gigantic bulk hurled through the air, an unleashed mass of power and fury. The weight of the beast as it struck him threw the inspector to the ground, but as he fell, he threw up an arm to protect his throat. The beast was almost on top of him, its jaws about his forearm, when Barlach heard the whip-crack of a shot. A sudden convulsion ran through the dog's massive body, and Barlach felt his hand become sticky with warm blood. The hound was dead. He scrambled to his feet, trembling, and cleaned his hand in the thin grass. Chance was there, pushing an automatic pistol back into his coat pocket as he came up. "Are you all right, Inspector?" "Perfectly. The brute's teeth didn't reach my arm. You saved my life, Chance." "Don't you ever carry a pistol?" said Chance. "Not often." Now the scene at the house had changed. The music had stopped, the lighted windows had been thrown open, and men and women in evening dress were leaning out. In the midmost of the 5 windows, a solitary man was standing. He called out, "Who's there, and what do you want?" "We're police officers," said Barlach. "We wish to speak to Herr Gastman." In heavy scorn, the man answered that he found it an extraordinary circumstance that they should need to shoot a dog in order to speak to Herr Gastman. "I'll meet you at the gate." The 2 policemen had no choice but to retrace their steps. At the main gate in front of the house, a solitary figure was awaiting them. "My name is Inspector Barlach. Are you Herr Gastman?" "My name is von Schwende, Colonel and member of the National Council." "Good Lord, man, what do you mean by letting off your guns around here?" "We're making inquiries into the murder of Police Lieutenant Schmidt and wish to speak to Herr Gastman, Councillor," said Barlach. "But what do you want with him?" said von Schwende. "What possible connection can there be between Gastman and the death of a lieutenant of police?" "The lieutenant was at Gastman's party last Wednesday night and was murdered on his way home." The councillor stood in silence, apparently thinking deeply. At last he said, "Well, I'm Gastman's lawyer. You can't possibly see Gastman tonight. Even the police must have some sense of social obligation. I'll find time for a word with Gastman later, and we'll come to your office in the morning." Then with a nod he turned and walked away towards the house. Barlach and Chance found themselves once more in front of the rusty bars of the gate. Chance was seemingly deep in thought. "It's 9 o'clock, Inspector," he said at last. "The best thing we can do is drive into Lamlingen and find out what Constable Kleiner can tell us about this Gastman." "Right," answered Barlach. "You talk to him. I shall go to that little restaurant at the entrance to the gorge. I must take something for my stomach. I'll wait for you there. It was 10 o'clock when Chance left Klena to drive to the restaurant which Barlach was to await him. But Barlach was not in the restaurant. The landlady said he had left for Toine about half an hour ago. He'd not been in the restaurant more than 5 minutes. As he drove off, Chance asked himself what the old man had been up to, but gave up his speculations when the narrowing road called for all his attention. He drove away fast, past the bridge where they had waited, and down into the wood. The jet darkness of the place gave him an uncanny feeling down his spine. With something of a shock, he realized he had reached the scene of the murder, and his heart gave a faster beat as a dark figure detached itself from the wall of rock and signaled to the car to stop. Without knowing why he did so, Chance pulled up and opened the near side door. The next moment he regretted his action as he remembered in a flash that this was precisely what Schmidt had done a few seconds before he was shot. Chance's hand flew to his coat pocket and his fingers closed round the pistol. The figure came closer, and Chance saw that it was Barlach. Barlach leaned forward, and they looked into each other's faces. Then Barlach got into the car, and Chance's fingers released their grip on the pistol in his pocket. "Drive on, Chance," said Barlach. Shortly after 11, the car drew up at Barlach's house in Altenburg, and the inspector got out. "Thanks again, Chance," she said, and shook his hand. "It's embarrassing to speak of, but you saved my life." He watched the car drive rapidly away till the rear light was lost in the distance. Then he entered his house by the unlocked door. Standing in his book-lined room, he put his hand in his coat pocket and brought out an object which he laid carefully on the desk beside the brass snake knife. It was a large, heavy, automatic pistol. Then he slowly removed his coat and jacket, revealing his left arm thickly wrapped in bandages. The bandages were loosely wound and bulky, such as men use to protect themselves when training dogs to attack intruders. When Chance and Barlach visited Gastman's house, the inspector was attacked by a large guard dog, which Chance shot dead. But unknown to Chance, Barlach was already wearing protective bandages and was clearly well prepared for the attack. The inspector knew from experience that some unpleasantness, for so he described the ever-present friction between himself and Lutz, was to be expected next morning. "All Saturdays are alike," he said to himself as he walked across the Altenburg Bridge. He was wearing formal black for Schmidt's funeral, which was to take place at 10 o'clock. He could not decently stay away from the ceremony, and this was the real cause of his irritability. Von Schwende called early at police headquarters. He belonged to the same political party as Lutz, and had played some part in Lutz's advancement. "You'd never believe, my dear Lucius," he began, as his stout figure appeared in the doorway of Lutz's office, "how these Bern policemen of yours behave. They actually shot my client Gastman's dog, a rare and valuable specimen from South America, and completely ruined Anatole Krauss-Raffaelli's piano recital. Your men have no manners." Lutz, who found the intervention of his political colleague embarrassing, offered von Schwende a chair. "You must understand," he began, intimidated despite himself, "that we are involved in a tricky investigation. The young police officer who is mainly responsible for its conduct is, by Swiss standards at least, an able man and a shrewd detective, although the inspector who was with him last night is, I admit, more than ready for the junk heap. I deeply regret the death of your client's hound, but you can trust me to have this incident properly investigated. The trouble is," he went on, "that our police methods are lamentably behind the times. When I recall what I saw of scientific detection in Chicago, I am forced to admit our present organization is quite hopeless. He paused for a moment, embarrassed by von Schwende's silence and by the unwinking stare the other had fixed on him. You surely ought to know whether Schmidt was a guest of your client last Wednesday night. My dear Lucius, said the Colonel, why all this humbug? Surely the police knew that Schmidt went to Gastmann's parties, and that he went under the name of Dr. Prantl, lecturer in American Cultural History at Munich University? If not, you and the whole police force should resign as criminally incompetent. Von Schwende drummed impatiently on Lutz's desk with the fingers of his right hand. We knew absolutely nothing of it, Oscar, said Lutz. From now on, said the councillor, the primary duty of the police is to find out Schmidt's reasons for going to Gastmann's. Well, in that case, the police must first know a great deal more about Gastmann. Gastmann does not enter into it, said von Schwende. Neither the police nor anyone else need concern themselves with him. He's had no hand in this affair and has no desire to be mixed up in it. That's his wish, he's my client, and my job is to see that his wishes are respected. Lutz was so nonplussed by this impertinent reply that at first he could find nothing to say. Then he sat back in his chair. Unfortunately, my dear Oscar, the fact that Schmidt went to Gastmann's compels us to give your client a measure of our attention. Very well, said von Schwende. Let's have the cards on the table. You'll soon see that it's not so much a question of my explaining Gastmann as of your explaining Schmidt. He produced a large white sheet of paper which he unfolded and placed on Lutz's desk. Here are the names of the persons who have been guests at Gastmann's house. I have divided it into 3 sections. The first section we can ignore because it consists only of artists. The second section consists of big businessmen. You will recognize their names. They are men of high position, men whom I regard as the backbone of Swiss society. And the third section? Asked Lutz, when the councillor suddenly stopped speaking. Von Schwende's pause was deliberate, intended to build up Lutz's nervous tension. The third section contains the names of members of the staff of a foreign embassy, and the embassy concerned considers it desirable that the staff should not be associated in the public mind with certain of the industrialists whose names appear in my second list. At last, Lutz began to understand what lay behind von Schwende's words. Am I to understand that official negotiations are going on with this power for a new trade agreement? Precisely. Negotiations are conducted officially and at high levels, because otherwise the diplomats would have nothing to do. But there are also unofficial negotiations, and in Lamlingen the talks are private and off the record. In modern industry there are some affairs in which the state may not interfere. Oh, of course, said Lutz. And unfortunately your deceased subordinate, Lieutenant Schmidt, insinuated himself into these secret negotiations under a false name. I can only repeat, said Lutz, that we have no knowledge of why Schmidt visited Gastmann. If the police did not send him there, someone else did, said von Schwende. Other governments, my dear Lucius, are vastly interested in what has been going on at Lamlingen. Schmidt was not a spy. We have every reason to assume that he was. Lutz rose from his chair and walked over to the window. I still don't see where Gastmann comes into all this. Von Schwende fanned himself with a sheet of paper. Gastmann put his house at the disposal of the parties concerned. That is all. But why Gastmann? My respected client happens to be the man with the necessary background and qualifications. Besides, He happens to live in Lamlingen. What difference does that make? Von Schwende smiled patronizingly. Had you ever heard of Lamlingen before Schmidt was murdered? Almost not. That's the reason, because nobody has ever heard of the place. We needed obscurity, and Lamlingen provided it. That's all there is to it, so you can safely leave Gastmann in peace. The important speculation now is whether our foreign friends will want to pursue negotiations when they are informed of the Schmidt murder. Millions are at stake, Lucius. Millions. I wish you luck with the Schmidt case. You'll need it. With these words, von Schwende stumped out of the room. Lutz had just the time to glance through the councillor's list and note with a groan the celebrity of many of the names it contained, when Barlach came in. He entered as usual without knocking. He had come to ask for authority to visit Gassmann at Lamlingen, but Lutz put off the discussion till the afternoon. It was time, he said, they set off for the funeral. They reached the street in silence, both in black coats. They turned up their collars. It was raining heavily, but it was not worthwhile to put up their umbrellas for the few steps to the car. Blatter was driving. The rain cascaded down, lashing slantwise against the windows. Lutz and Barlach sat motionless, each in his corner. Barlach put his hand to his stomach, as he had done so often in recent months. "Are you in pain?" said Lutz. "Always." They fell silent again. Lutz peered through the window. The rain began to subside a little. They had already reached the avenue leading to the Schoschhallen cemetery, which now came towards them between the steaming tree trunks as a dripping grey mass of masonry. Blatter drove into the courtyard and stopped. They got out, put up their umbrellas, and set off on foot between the lines of graves. Schmidt's coffin had not yet been lowered. The priest was reading from the Bible, and beside him, holding an umbrella over both their heads, the gravedigger. Barlach and Lutz stopped at the graveside. Someone was crying. It was Frau Schönler, round and shapeless under the unceasing rain. At her side was Chance. He had no umbrella, but the collar of his raincoat was turned up. Beside him was a girl, pale, hatless, her fair hair hanging down in dripping strands. Anna, thought Barlach. Chance bowed to them. Lutz nodded in return, but the inspector gave no sign of recognition. He looked across at the other figures round the grave, all policemen, all in mufti, all with the same raincoats, the same black bowler hats, holding umbrellas aloft like sabres, fantastic mourners, come from God knows where, unfitting to the occasion. Suddenly 2 men in black frock coats and top hats came staggering across the cemetery, bawling out some tavern song. They carried between them a huge laurel wreath, from which a ribbon hung down, trailing along the ground. They were great loutish fellows, so drunk that they were always on the point of falling. They ran for the group of mourners, singing at the tops of their voices, and plunged right through them, even between Frau Schönler and Chance. No one hindered them, everyone watching as though petrified. Then they were stumbling away through the wet grass, holding each other up, clinging to each other, falling over graves in the violence of their intoxication. Their song died away in the rain, and the last glimpse of them was gone. Only the wreath remained, carelessly tossed on the coffin, bearing the words in smeared ink on the muddy ribbon, "To our dear Dr. Prantl." Lutz dropped Barlach off at his front door. The inspector removed his wet shoes before entering the house. At the doorway to his sitting room, he stopped short. A man was sitting at his writing table, turning over the papers from Schmidt's briefcase. With his right hand he was playing with Barlach's Turkish knife. "So it's you," said the inspector. "Yes, it's me," said the man. Barlach closed the door and sat down in his armchair, facing the desk. He watched in silence as the other went on calmly turning over the papers from Schmidt's briefcase, an almost rustic figure, calm and reserved, with short hair and deep-set eyes in a full, large-boned face. "So you call yourself Gastmann now?" said the old man at last. The other tapped Schmidt's briefcase with his forefinger. "You've known that for some time. You set that young fellow on my track. These notes are yours." Barlach glanced at his writing table. His automatic was still there, the butt towards him. He had only to put out his hand. He said, "I shall never stop hunting you. One day I shall get you." "You'll have to hurry, Barlach," answered the other. "You haven't much time left. The doctors give you another year, and only then if you let them operate at once." "True," said the old man. 12 more months. But I can't let them operate now. The time has come to act. It's my last chance." After attending Schmidt's funeral, Inspector Barlach returned home to find the man known as Gastmann going through his papers. Clearly the inspector had been hunting Gastmann for many years, and the dead policeman had been attending Gastmann's parties on the inspector's orders. But Gastmann had also discovered that the inspector was living on borrowed time. "The doctors give you another year," he said, "and only then if you let them operate at once. This is your last chance." "True," said the old man. Then they were silent, sitting there as though they would never move or speak again. "It's over 40 years, began the other at last, since we first met in that decaying wine shop on the Bosphorus. I remember it so clearly. You, Barlach, were a young Swiss policeman working for the Turks, and I was a footloose adventurer. I still am. We liked each other at first sight. But presently the local schnapps of fermented dates began to work on us. Our eyes shone like red-hot coals, and our tongues became fiery. I love to think of that hour. It determined the course of your life and mine." He laughed. Barlach sat watching him in silence. "You have 1 more year to live," he went on, "and you've spent 40 stubbornly tracking me down. That's how the account stands. Do you remember what we talked about that night, Barlach, in that stinking wine shop, its atmosphere thick with Turkish cigarette smoke? You were the champion of law and order. The wrongdoer, you said, always pays for his crime. How? Because no crime is perfect. Crime is a fool's game because it is impossible to foresee the moves of men and women as one can foresee the moves on a chessboard. I, on the other hand, maintain that it is just this chaos in human relationships that makes it possible to commit crime and get away with it." So we went on arguing, stimulated by the raw schnapps and the ardor of youth. Much later that night we made a wager, a bet, with the satanic appeal of an impious joke that blasphemes the divinity. "Yes," said Barlach, "we made that wager. But you never thought I would see it through." "I never thought any man would do as you did." "That's because you've never known the meaning of temptation. But I have, and to me it was a challenge that could not be resisted, to commit a major crime, actually in your presence, without your being able to convict me of it." 3 days later, said Barlach, immersed in his memories, we were walking across the Mahmud Bridge with a German shopkeeper, and I saw you push him into the water. You couldn't prove it was murder. You had me arrested, had me put through hours of cross-examination, but to no purpose. The court accepted my story that the German had killed himself. You won, said Barlach, because you proved that the German was on the point of bankruptcy. Well, naturally, I chose my victim carefully, my friend. And that is how you first became a criminal, said the inspector. The other played absent-mindedly with the Turkish knife. Well, I can't deny that I've found crime intensely interesting. As the years went by, I grew to be a better criminal, and you became a better and better policeman. But I was always a jump ahead of you, and you've never been able to catch up. I've crossed your path again and again, committing crimes under your very nose, bolder, madder, badder crimes, and each time you have failed to convict me. You've triumphed over fools, but never over me. Your lifelong object has been to destroy me, and mine to exist in spite of you. That one night on the Bosphorus chained us to each other forever. He stood up, the briefcase in his hand. I'll take this with me. This time I shall bring you to justice, said Barlach. It must be this time, for it is my last chance. He patted Barlach on the shoulder and walked past him. The door opened and closed. Barlach still sat in his armchair. Then came the pain, the throbbing, stabbing pain, like a sun rising inside him. It threw him on the sofa and convulsed him, scalding him with feverish heat. Finally he lay still, bathed in cold sweat. Barlach felt better after the attack. It was a long time since last he had been free from pain. He drank mulled wine in little cautious sips. That was his only food and drink. But he did not fail to take his usual walk through the town and along the Bundesstrasse. Though utterly weary, every step in the rain-washed air did him good. Shortly afterwards he was sitting in Lutz's office. Lutz noticed nothing amiss. He decided he must tell Barlach at once of his talk with von Schwende. To his immeasurable surprise and relief, the inspector agreed that it was better to wait for government instructions. Of course, I have found out a good deal about Gastmann, said Lutz. Enough to be sure that he could not possibly be regarded as a suspect. Oh, of course, said the old man. We're still making inquiries about his two manservants. It was they who behaved so disgracefully at the funeral, a joke in the worst possible taste. Gastmann seems to be in the habit of making jokes. The inspector, who had got up to leave, said suddenly, I wish to apply for a week's sick leave, Dr. Lutz. Very well, answered Lutz, his hand over the receiver, for the call had just come through. Take a rest. Schanz was waiting in Barlach's office. Let's drive out to Gastmann's, he said. It's getting late. Barlach put on his overcoat. We'll go to the writer fellow who was at the party that night. Why must we work in such a roundabout way? Protested Schanz, as he followed Barlach down the stairs. The inspector stopped as they reached the door. There's Schmidt's blue Mercedes. Schanz explained that it was now his, that he had bought it and was paying for it by hire purchase. He got into the driver's seat. Barlach took the seat beside him, and they drove across the Bahnhofplatz towards the hospital. Going via Inns again, said Barlach. I like that route. Barlach looked across the rain-washed fields. Everything was bathed in bright, tranquil light. The two men were silent. Only once did Schanz speak. Frau Schönler tells me you took a briefcase from Schmidt's room. Was nothing official, Schanz. Just private papers. The man of letters received them in his study, dressed in jeans and a brown leather jacket. Without rising from his paper-strewn desk, he turned sideways in his chair to face his visitors. He pointed to two comfortable armchairs, and when they were seated, they found to their annoyance that they were facing the light from the window. They themselves could scarcely see his face. We're making inquiries into the death of Police Lieutenant Schmidt, began the inspector. He was the man who was found dead on the hill above Thuan. I know Dr. Prantl, the man who was spying on Gastmann, said the dark figure between them and the window. Gastmann told me about it. Do you want my alibi? No, said Barlach, we've already got your alibi. At 12:30 on the night of the murder, you met a forester between Lamlingen and Schnelz, and the two of you walked home together. The forester said you were quite merry. Well, what else do you want? Said the novelist. How often do you go to Gastman's? Occasionally. Why? The writer laughed. Well, he's an interesting chap, Gastman. A man of his kind attracts a novelist as honey attracts bees. Did Gastman kill Schmidt? Said Chance. The crudity of the question made Barlach shake his head. The dark figure by the window laughed again. You don't beat about the bush, do you? Answer me, please, said Chance. Barlach waited, curious to see how their man would react. The writer was quite unruffled. At what time was the policeman killed? Shortly before midnight, said Chance. I don't know whether the rules of logic are valid for the police, said the writer. Personally, I doubt it. But as the local police have already ascertained, I met the forester on the Chanel's road at 12:30, which means that I must have left Gastman not earlier than 20 past. Gastman, therefore, obviously could not have committed the murder. Barlach and Chance went back to the car. Now for Gastman, said Chance as he started the engine, but Barlach shook his head. Back to Bern. As they drove towards Ligetz, the landscape opened out in vast depths ahead. Then at a sharp turn of the road, the convex shield of the lake appeared perpendicularly below them. Chance stopped the car. I must talk to you, Inspector, he said. What about? Asked Barlach, staring down the precipitous rock face. Gastman. We must talk to Gastman. It's the only way to make progress. It's the logical thing to do. And especially, we must talk to those servants of his. Barlach leaned back in his seat. Unfortunately, Chance, we can't always do the logical thing. Lutz insists that we leave Gastman alone, and it's not unreasonable, now that he's had to surrender the case to government ruling. We have to wait on their instructions. But Chance was not to be put off. We want the truth. We want the man who murdered Schmidt. True enough, said Barlach. Chance suddenly lost patience. He gripped the older man by the shoulders. For years, I've been kept in the background, Inspector. I've always been passed over, looked down on, kicked around, and treated like a superior sort of postman. I don't deny it, Chance, said Barlach. For years you've played second fiddle to a man who now has been murdered. Simply because he had a better education, because he knew Latin and things like that. You're not being fair to him, said Barlach. Schmidt was the best policeman I have ever known. Chance disregarded Barlach's work. And now, at last, I have a chance of promotion. It's to be snatched away from me and lost because of some idiotic game of diplomacy. You're the only one who could change that, Inspector. Speak to Lutz. No, Chance, I can't. Very well, said Chance. Suddenly he released Barlach and took hold of the wheel, though he was still trembling and deadly pale. Very well. You won't help me. That evening, Barlach called to see his doctor, Dr. Basler. Barlach looked down from Basler's window onto the surging crowds of people in the square, while the doctor packed up his instruments. A blue Mercedes drove up and stopped between other cars. Barlach's glance became more intent. Chance got out of the car. He had a girl with him in a white raincoat. Her hair flowed down to her shoulders in a blonde cascade. Ever had burglars, Fritz? Asked the inspector. Well, not burglars, but I once found that my desk had been ransacked, said Basler. Why didn't you report it to the police? Well, the doctor scratched his head. No money was taken. Even so, I did intend to report it. I suppose I forgot all about it. I see, said Barlach. So that, he thought, is how Gastman got to know about me. He turned his back to the window. Well, what's the verdict? We've only a few days in which to operate, said Basler. In 3 or 4 days, you will have another attack, and you will not survive it. But meanwhile, I still have at least 2 days. 2 days. You can operate on the morning of the 8th, Fritz. On Tuesday morning. When Barlach visited his doctor, it was clear that his health was fading fast, and he agreed to have his operation within 2 days. Barlach woke suddenly nearly 3 hours after midnight. On the doctor's advice, he had gone to bed early and taken a sleeping pill. It was the first time he had done so, and for a moment he attributed his sudden waking to this unaccustomed measure. Then he knew he had been awakened by a noise. It took him some seconds to remember where he was. He was not in the room where he usually slept, but in his library. Expecting a bad night, he remembered it now, to read. He must have fallen into a sudden, deep sleep. The blackness of the windowless room was profound, but not complete. Presently he managed to make out through the gloom a bookcase, a chair, then the edge of the table, on which he recalled his automatic pistol was lying. Barlach rose and snatched up the pistol. Gripping his automatic, the old man cautiously opened the door to the bedroom, went in, and leaned against the wall. Suddenly he saw the thin beam of a flash lamp in the library. It glided across the floor, over the armchair, and finally reached the desk. Its ray lit up the snake knife. Barlach saw a hand through the open door in front of him. It was cased in a brown leather glove. It groped across the desk and closed round the handle of the snake knife. The flash lamp went out. The old man stood motionless, waiting for the enemy who had come to kill him. At last he became conscious of the approaching attacker. He felt a vague chill on his cheek. The assassin had acted unexpectedly. He had reached the bedroom by a roundabout route, remaining invisible, inaudible, irresistible, with a snake knife in his hand. Barlach decided he must act first. He aimed at the window overlooking the river. He fired 3 times in rapid succession, through the splintering glass out towards the river. Then he dropped to the floor, and as he did so, something hissed above his head. It was the knife, quivering now in the wall. But the old man had done what he wanted. Light shone up in the neighboring windows. The people in the next house were leaning from their open windows. Barlach rose to his feet. The light from the next house flooded the bedroom. He caught a vague glimpse of a figure in the dining-room doorway. Then the outer door slammed, and there was silence. Half an hour passed before he went into the corridor. He telephoned Shans and asked him to come round. Then he seated himself in his armchair. Outside, a car drove up and braked sharply. Suddenly the front door opened, and Shans entered the room. "Someone's been trying to kill me," said the inspector. Shans was hatless and pale. His hair hung in disorder over his forehead, and his pyjamas showed under his overcoat. Barlach told him the whole story. Barlach lay down on the divan and drew the rug over him. "You couldn't see who it was?" said Shans. "No, but I know who it was. I know." Barlach got up at 6 after a sleepless night. It was Sunday. He telephoned for a taxi, intending to breakfast on the train. He got into his thick winter overcoat and went out into the grey morning light. The taxi drew up and stopped. "The station," said Barlach, getting in. The car moved off. "Well," said a voice at his side, "how are you this morning? Have a good night?" Barlach looked round. At the far end of the seat was Gastman. He was wearing a light raincoat, and his arms were folded. On his hands were leather gloves. The driver turned his head and grinned. It was one of Gastman's manservants. "What do you want of me now?" said Barlach. "Do you still believe I killed Schmidt?" "I have never believed it for a moment," said Barlach. "I did not succeed in convicting you of a crime I know you committed. So now I shall get you convicted of a crime I know you have not committed." The car slowed down and stopped. They had reached the station. The next time we meet, I shall not talk to you, Barlach, said Gustman. The next time I shall kill you. That is, if you survive your operation. You're mistaken, said Barlach. I'm the only man who can judge you, Gustman, and I've sentenced you to death. Today the sentence will be carried out. Today the executioner will come to kill you. It was almost noon when Chance reached Ligette's. He left the car there and continued his journey on foot, climbing steadily through the vineyards and the woodlands in the hot sun. Finally he reached a gate and went through it. Chance made straight for the front door. This too was open. He found himself in a great hall. There he stopped. Facing him, not 5 steps away, was Gustman. At his side ranged the powerful figures of his 2 manservants, motionless and menacing, like 2 huge butchers. All 3 were wearing overcoats. Trunks and cases were piled up close by. All was ready for instant departure. Chance did not move. "So it's you," said Gustman. Then he began to laugh. "So that's what the old man meant." It's not bad at all. Quietly, deliberately, and without a word, one of the thugs took a pistol from his pocket and fired. Chance felt the bullet strike him in the left shoulder. He drew his right hand from his pocket and dodged aside. He fired 3 times into Gustman's laughing face, and his laughter died away in empty, infinite space. "There they are, all 3, said Lutz next morning with a gesture towards the bodies. Von Schwende nodded. "And Chance?" "2 bullets in the left forearm." "What about Schmidt's murder?" said the councillor. "We found a briefcase of Schmidt's in Gustman's house. It contained a full story of Gustman's career and evidence on his crimes. Schmidt was out to bring Gustman to book, and he was doing it as a private individual. It was a mistake for which he paid with his life, for we have proof that Gustman was responsible for Schmidt's murder. Schmidt was killed with the same pistol that one of the dead servants was clasping." Barlach came into the mortuary. The bodies lay on stretchers, covered over with black sheets. Barlach went up to the middle stretcher and uncovered the body. It was Gustman's. Barlach stood over him. Thus they faced each other for the last time, the hunter and the hunted. Punctually at 8 o'clock that evening, Chance arrived at Barlach's house in Altenburg. He had received an urgent invitation to be there at that hour. To his surprise, he was admitted by a young servant girl in a white apron. The table was formally laid for 2 people. Lighted candles shone in the candlesticks, and Barlach was seated in an easy chair at one end of the table, his face ruddy in the quiet candle glow, the picture of unruffled calm. "Sit down, Chance," called the old man. "I didn't know I was to come to dinner." "We must celebrate your triumph," said the inspector, and clapped his hands. The door opened, and a portly woman bore in a dish, overflowing with sardines, crayfish, and gherkins, as well as tomato and green pea salads. Mountains of eggs and mayonnaise garnished, cold meats, cold chicken, and salmon. The old man helped himself to everything. Chance watched in astonishment. "I thought you were seriously ill, Inspector." "Not today, Chance, not today. I'm celebrating. I've got my hands on Schmidt's murderer at last." He emptied his second glass of wine and began on a pie. Then he ordered champagne. Chance could not believe his ears. "You've been shamming," he said. "You're not ill." For a while the inspector did not answer. He just laughed and gave all his attention to a salad. "Yes, Chance," he said, "at last. I've been shamming." He crammed a chunk of roast veal into his mouth and went on eating. Then in a flash, Chance guessed the truth. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. "So you know, Inspector?" "I know, Chance. said Barlach. You murdered Schmidt. He took up his glass of champagne and emptied it at one draught. You'll never be able to prove it against me, said Chance. The old man sat back in his chair, no longer frail and sick, but strong and masterful. Haven't you realized, Chance, that you betrayed yourself long ago? It was your pistol. The bullet that killed Gerstmann's hound and saved my life came from the same gun that killed Schmidt. Yours, Chance. You yourself provided all the proof I needed. So that's why I couldn't find the body of the dog, said Chance. Did you know that Gerstmann owned that hound? Certainly. Before we set out, I took the precaution of protecting my arm with bandages. So even in that you laid a trap for me. Even in that. You had watched Schmidt for weeks. You were jealous of his ability, his success, his education, even his girl. You knew that he was after Gerstmann, but you didn't know why. Then by chance, his briefcase fell into your hands. You determined to take over the Gerstmann case, kill Schmidt, and for once have a success yourself. You were right in believing it would be easy to pin a murder on Gerstmann, and now you've got what you wanted. Schmidt's success, his job, his car, and his girl. You played a cat-and-mouse game with me, said Chance. I played a game with you. There was nothing else I could do. You killed Schmidt, and I had to get you for it. Suddenly Chance realized the whole truth. In order to kill Gerstmann. As you say, I spent 2/3 of my life trying to corner Gerstmann, and Schmidt was my last hope. Then you came, Chance, with your petty ambition, and snatched my chance away. So I took you, the murderer, and used you for my purpose. You knew it was I who attacked you, said Chance tonelessly. Right from the very first moment. Then you set us on each other like dogs. 2 wild beasts, came the pitiless reply. You appointed yourself the judge, and me the executioner. Precisely. But now the Schmidt case is settled. I will keep your secret. Only go. Anywhere. Never let me see you again. To judge one man is enough. Now go. Barlach spent the night in his armchair. The immense energy that had risen within him earlier in the evening had subsided and now threatened to die out completely. He had dared all in one last audacious throw. Yet in only one respect had he lied to Chance. Early next morning, as dawn was breaking, Lutz came storming into the room to report breathlessly that Chance had been found dead, that a train had run into his car at the level crossing between Ligertz and Thuan. Lutz found the inspector mortally ill. With an effort, Barlach asked him to remind Dr. Basler that it was Tuesday. Tell him I'm ready for him, he said. Then the old man sat and stared out of the window into the glass-clear morning. 12 months more, Lutz heard him say. Just 1 year.